Hey, Jessica.
Hi, Rain.
I'm so happy to be here with you. We were just talking about how we haven't actually seen each other in person or in a virtual room for so long, probably 10 to 15 years, something like that.
Mhm. It has been a very long time, but it is very sweet to be together. And I was just saying to you that you look exactly the same. It's wild. Like you're timeless.
I'm very
Which you are.
tickled by that. Yes, timelessness is present for sure. But I also feel so much aging happening in my body because I think the last time we were together in the same time and space, I was probably pregnant, just about to have my son or something like that. And he's 10 now. So I feel mountain older.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel wiser?
I feel more aware of things that I was not aware of before.
Mm.
And sometimes that might be similar to wisdom.
Yeah, that sounds like wisdom to me. Waking up.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I love to start conversations with gratitude, and I'm wondering what you're feeling grateful for today.
Hmm. I am feeling grateful for my husband who helped me set up for this conversation and just in general is a incredible friend to me.
Mm. That's great to have such a close and loving partnership.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I know we'll dive in a little bit more in a bit, but my specialty as a therapist is relationships. And that comes from a very personal place, which is I'm very relationally focused and also didn't always have the relationships I wanted
Mm.
growing up or in my romantic life. So it feels so miraculous to
Mhm.
find the connections that are, yeah, deeply nourishing.
Mhm. When did you discover that through your psychotherapy practice, you wanted to specialize in relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I went in knowing that actually. So in graduate school, my first thought was that I was going to help people with eating disorders because I had recovered from an eating disorder and kind of knew that landscape well. But as I studied more, I just realized I have always been a romantic. I've always been somebody who's been really fascinated by particularly romantic relationships, but just intimacy in general. And that was what was going to allow me to come alive more.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I actually started my dating coaching business in grad school. And then once I graduated with a master's in counseling psychology from CIIS, which is also where you went,
Mhm.
I started my internship, gaining all of my hours to become a marriage and family therapist, focusing on dating, couples, and also social anxiety.
Mhm. I remember, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I have it that we first met at the East Bay Healing Collective, and you were renting space to do your groups for social anxiety and dating. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's exactly right. And I think at some point we also found we had mutual connections. Like at some point, I remember us being at the same wedding. Uh,
I think you're right. Whose wedding was that?
I don't even remember.
Ah, I think you're right.
And I think I met your husband.
Oh,
I
yeah,
don't
I know
remember
who it
what
was.
that.
It was right. It was Peter Adams and Caroline.
Right. And see, I don't even know those names. I was
Oh,
with a date.
oh, oh, that is even funnier. I think it was that wedding because they also were at CIS.
Okay. So funny. I hope my date knows who those people are.
Did you crash a wedding?
I might have. It's possible.
Yeah, so we're connected in various ways. Grad school, the East Bay Healing Collective, and probably ways we don't even know yet.
Right. Yeah. And I think at some point we shared a client or two. I was serving as the therapist, and you were doing some really incredible sort of hands-on trauma healing work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. I am taking a deep breath because I do remember a client that we shared, and it was a difficult case, and I still think about the learning of um, that person. And
Yeah.
trauma is so important to heal and move all the way through. And there's some trauma that gets very, very stuck in the body, in the mind. The tendency is so deep, and sometimes in psychology, there are these very, not with this particular client, so now I'm not talking about anybody specific, but I'm talking more general about personality disorders and borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and other tendencies that are so deep. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of commitment to see the healing all the way through.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I think a team,
Mhm,
more than one person who cares.
mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds like wisdom.
Yeah.
So I have found on my show the most popular episodes on Every Moment is Sacred are about narcissism. And this really surprised me because I did not go into podcasting expecting to speak about narcissism in depth, but
Right.
I find it very interesting what people want to listen to and what people listen to again and again and again. And given that, one of the reasons why I wanted to speak with you, Jessica, was because I see you as an expert in the field of psychology and healing in this way. I'm so interested in what you have to share about narcissism.
Yeah. Yeah. So happy to dive into that. And the thing that comes to mind, I'm curious about your interpretation of why
Hmm.
narcissism is the most popular topic. I've been on another podcast. This is not about your body with Jesse Newland. And I spoke about the impact of growing up with a narcissistic parent. And I believe they said at some point that it was also the most popular episode.
Hmm.
And so it seems like there is something really important about the topic. And I also think it's interesting to me what you're saying about people listening more than once, potentially,
Hmm.
because I think that when you're when you've been in a relationship with a narcissist, there can be so many crazy making aspects to the relationship
Hmm.
that it takes repetitive going over what happened and understanding it through the lens of narcissism to really land back in what's true rather than the reality that the narcissist created. So I wonder if that's part of it. It's like kind of ungaslighting yourself, like
Hmm.
listening to materials over and over again to reassure yourself that, or for the listener to reassure themselves, I'm not crazy, actually.
Hmm. Hmm. That sounds right. And to define some terms, how would you describe gaslighting?
So gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation where the person, often a narcissist, basically communicates to you that the reality that you're seeing is false, is wrong. And it serves the narcissist by allowing them to behave poorly and not be held accountable, or to construct a reality where the person feels insecure, vulnerable, and starts to doubt themselves, such that they're more like sort of receptive to the narcissistic behaviors. So an example of this would be, let's say you are having a conversation with somebody who's narcissistic and they, I don't know, blame you for something that you didn't really do. And then later you call them on it and they say, I didn't say that.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so all of a sudden you're thinking, did I make it up? Was I overreacting?
Hmm.
Maybe I'm too sensitive.
Hmm. Yeah. What's wrong with me for having that thought?
Right. Right. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And when that happens again and again and again, along with other narcissistic manipulations and tendencies, I imagine the person affected by the narcissist can either end up feeling abused, or there could be some emotional abuse that's happening. Would you say that's so?
Yeah. I mean, I think when there's repeated gaslighting, I think it's pretty safe to say abuse is happening.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes when I'm working with my clients and when there is, so I'm a spiritual counselor and I'm not a psychotherapist, but I still work very therapeutically with people. And some of the material a person would bring to a therapist, they sometimes bring to me. So I get a window into this, the psychology of relationship and such. So sometimes people will describe a gaslighting situation or a pretty severe emotional manipulation, and they will want to brush it off and say, oh, well, how do I know it wasn't that person having a bad day? Or how do I know it was just, you know, something not so serious? Like I could have done that. I could have said that or done that. And so, how do we discern between a narcissistic tendency that's actually damaging a relationship and is a sign of somebody who has a deep struggle within themselves compared to just kind of a normal life happening where any of us can make a relationship error or a communication mistake?
Right. Yeah. This is a really important question. I think that this is the sort of question that we can only answer over time in relationship. And by looking specifically at the person's capacity for empathy over time.
Mm.
So somebody who's not narcissistic is going to generally be empathic, compassionate, receptive to our thoughts and feelings, not just on a cognitive level, but on a heart level. We can feel them feeling with us pretty consistently, unless they have maybe a really bad day. And in that moment, perhaps they are not their best selves. Maybe they criticize or lash out or do something that it doesn't seem particularly empathic. But then they return to themselves when they're not under a lot of stress. And they're also able to apologize and take accountability for that moment.
Mm.
Versus somebody who's narcissistic is on balance going to lack empathy or have very spotty empathy. And their empathy is generally going to be kind of cognitive. So they're going to maybe understand why people do things, but you're not necessarily going to feel them feeling with you
Mhm.
on a consistent basis. And they're also not going to take responsibility frequently for moments where they maybe lash out at you. That's where the gaslighting comes in. No, I didn't say that.
Mhm.
You're being way too sensitive about this. Rather than, you know what? I was having a really bad day and I messed up. I'm really sorry. How can I make it up to you?
Mhm. Mhm. Mm.
And as you know, as I said a little bit earlier, we kind of can't tell that unless we've had a few interactions with somebody, which is part of what's tricky. I think, we can get into how to sort of spot a narcissist, which I know is a very big topic. And I want to just normalize, like sometimes we do have to get to know someone over time, particularly because a lot of narcissists can be quite charming at the beginning.
Yes, that is a characteristic I have found to be true about narcissism in my research and in experience in my studies, that there's a charm that goes along with that personality type, whether it's a full disorder or strong tendencies or just tendencies that come and go, that there's a charm that's very compelling to another
Mhm.
person.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's like they know how to play into a persona or a way of being that is compelling to us, that looks attractive or exciting. But attractive and exciting are very different from connected and caring.
Yeah, good point. Going back to your question about why people might be listening to podcast episodes on narcissism again and again, or just those episodes are reaching many people, perhaps. I gather from the guests on my show who have wanted to tell their story of narcissistic parents or partners, that the experience of being affected by a narcissist is so hidden and like it's taboo to talk about because the narcissist wouldn't tolerate being called out on whatever behavior they're having that's hurtful to the other person. So I think that people live with kind of a secret or something that's difficult to have an audience for, and with a very innate and understandable need to be heard. I think people want to tell their stories, and then other people want to hear them because it starts to normalize an experience that probably more people have than we know of being affected by a narcissist in one way or another.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. So somebody who is narcissistic can't tolerate hits to their ego or their reputation. And what's underneath that is difficulty tolerating shame. And so they set up relationships and environments where the other person can't speak up. Right? Again, there's that lack of accountability. And there's even, it sounds like what you're describing is a trauma response. This terrible thing happened to me and I can't speak up about it because whether the narcissist is in my life or not, I feel like I'm going to be attacked if I say something.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is their sort of safer way of having their reality validated. It's a really, in that way, I think, very intelligent and adaptive way
Mm-hmm.
to have their story validated, to listen to these sorts of episodes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's magic in storytelling and being heard and learning how to tell one's story too. A story can also change over time once it gets aired out.
Yes, you were trained as an expressive art therapist, so I'm assuming you worked a lot with story and
Yes.
training as a healer.
Yes, absolutely. And I love the expressive art for that reason, that there's so many ways of telling a story through art, through drama, through song, through, I mean, you name it. The creative process is healing when we take it to be so.
Yeah. I was trained as a drama therapist, which is a subsection of expressive arts, and so a lot of embodied storytelling. And what I love is that we also have science that backs all of that up. We have science that says when we've been traumatized, a lot of that trauma material that we kind of lock away is locked away in the right brain and in the body. And when we can tell that story through metaphor or through movement or through playing as many times as we need to, really, we move it into the part of our brain that is the prefrontal cortex, that is the kind of adult part of our brain that has more control over it. So that story isn't lodged somewhere where it can just kind of trigger, take us over.
Something that I've come across recently that I didn't know about is the difference between covert and overt narcissism.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting concept. And something I actually just learned recently is that can refer to two different things. So covert and overt narcissism can actually refer to the behaviors or the aspects of narcissism that are on the surface versus invisible. So, for example, overt narcissistic behavior is like grandstanding, so kind of bragging about I'm so wonderful or I'm so generous or whatever it is, versus overt narcissism in terms of behavior are the thoughts internally that you just can't see from the outside.
Mm.
And there's also, some people think of narcissists as covert or overt narcissists. So the overt narcissists are the people that are really obviously narcissistic, and the covert narcissists are the ones who it's actually kind of hard to tell sometimes, because maybe they are perfectly lovely in public, but at home they're belittling to their family or entitled. And I think that can be a really helpful concept, covert narcissism, because I think most people are dealing more with covert narcissists in their life than the overt. Like most people see an overt narcissist and they're like, no, thank you. But the covert narcissist, because it's so variable depending on the situation, it's easier to get into those relationships.
So this is a great transition into how to spot a narcissist, which you mentioned a few moments ago. How does
Mhm.
one spot a narcissist?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think the number one thing to look for is entitlement.
Mm.
And I think it's really important to look for that entitlement over time. Again, but not to assume you can spot it in one sitting with somebody. But one thing that really differentiates narcissists from people who maybe sometimes are a little self-absorbed or selfish is that they do have this sense of, I should be treated differently from other people because I am special. So what that might look like is, let's say you have a general boundary that you hold with most people. Okay, let's say it's, yeah, I don't really accept calls after 10 because I'm going to bed. And you meet somebody, maybe you're dating, you meet somebody who really pushes that boundary and they want to be able to talk to you basically at any time. And if you restate that boundary, they get angry and continue to push. Or you might see it in the form of going out to eat. And if the servers, if the host don't treat them very, like they're very special, they might get kind of moody or huffy or kind of demand a different kind of attention. Yeah, so I would definitely look first and foremost for that piece.
Mhm. That boundary example is so interesting to me. And let's say I have the boundary of no calls after 10 p.m. and somebody pushes against that boundary, and I just politely and firmly hold it. If the person is not a narcissist or doesn't have strong narcissistic tendencies, how might a healthy response go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the healthy response would be, oh, I really wanted to talk to you, but I totally get it. Looking forward to talking to you when you're available. Yeah, or you can think of it in terms of like customer service. Before becoming a therapist, was in customer service for a while, and it's so interesting to see the difference between people who, when they say sign up for something that has a fee
Mhm.
and the company holds them to that fee. Some people would be like, I'm not happy that they had to pay the fee, but if you reminded them, you actually signed a contract that said you're going to pay for this, they would be like, oh, okay, I guess I understand. Versus the maybe more narcissistic people would just rage, you know, to these, myself and my peers, we were like 21 at this call center, just really being verbally abused by some of these people. Yeah. So I think, again, there's that piece of entitlement, and part of that is the accountability piece. Can they take accountability for their actions?
Mhm. Yeah, so key. It takes a lot of emotional maturity to take responsibility for one's actions.
Yeah. Absolutely.
There are a few different directions I could see myself going in this conversation, but what is pulling at your heart? What, either about narcissism or dating or in the realm of just open ended questions about narcissism, what is present for you right now that you would like to speak about?
Um, well, I think I am thinking about pacing in dating and just generally using the process of dating to really see what's true about both a relationship and a person. Because I know that a lot of people who maybe listen to episodes like this, they've been in a romantic relationship with a narcissist, which can be so incredibly traumatizing. And when they re-enter the dating pool, they feel terrified, understandably, of getting caught in that kind of relationship again. Yeah, so maybe let's talk a little bit about narcissism and dating and how it can show up,
Yeah.
and then sort of how to work with that.
Mhm. Mhm. I like some of the examples you gave about spotting a narcissist. And it sounds to me like if I were in the dating world again, I might really consider how the other person takes responsibility for things, how they listen to me, if they're really able to reflect what I'm saying, if they're able to share openly and vulnerably about themselves, pass the charm. Are those the kinds of things that you would begin with in just kind of beginning when somebody's meeting a bunch of folks?
Absolutely. I would also be looking at how do they treat people around them. So if you go out to eat, again, that example of the restaurant, perhaps they're being perfectly lovely to you and really, putting the charm on. But then when their server comes, they're moody, demanding, that's worth really noticing,
Mhm.
because at some point you could very easily switch places with the server in their eyes
Mhm.
in terms of they might become belittling to you. Um, so that's one piece I would look at. The other piece related to pacing is that a lot of narcissists will do something called love bombing. And within love bombing, they'll do something called fast forwarding. So love bombing is when they basically pull out all the stops to sweep you off of your feet. So that might be showering you with praise, giving lots of gifts, doing grand romantic gesture, really kind of like playing into the role of the knight in shining armor or the perfect woman. And that can be really effective for getting you attached, such that when the other side of the coin, when they flip to devaluing you, maybe treating you more like that server, you're already attached. You're already in.
Mm.
Right? So it's a kind of tactic that allows them to manipulate you ultimately. Another form of this, as I mentioned, is fast forwarding. So that's where they fast forward you through the normal stages of dating. So it looks like we met on a Friday and we had a 48-hour first date that was so epic and so romantic. And by the next weekend, they've taken you to Tahoe for a 3-day weekend. And by the next weekend, they are suggesting you both move in together. And I'm giving you a relatively extreme version of this, but I think you get the picture. It's not like standard pacing for a lot of people, or at least for a relationship that is more of the healthy, kind of slow burn kind of relationship.
Mhm.
And similarly, it's a kind of sweeping you off your feet. So you're not necessarily seeing the parts of the relationship that are maybe not working, or where you're getting attached to the extent that when other sides of this person come out, you're less likely to pull away. Coming back to pacing, this is the piece I talk about a lot with my clients, my dating therapy and coaching clients is, can you be incredibly intentional with your pacing? And there's sort of two sides to that. But can you be intentional with your pacing such that you are mindfully tuning into what is true about the other person, about the relationship, and about how you feel, rather than being swept up in uncontrollable tide or stream that is not in your control? And so oftentimes what that means is pausing, right? Letting yourself have space between days to really tune into how you're feeling about the person, questions you have, concerns that you have, allowing yourself to kind of come back to earth long enough to even notice, like, is this person maybe rushing me a little bit? And even though it feels great because I've always wanted to be loved, so deeply, there's also something about it that maybe reminds me of another narcissistic person I was in relationship with. There's some part of my system, my gut, that's saying, feel, feel like not quite right.
Are you suggesting that in that pause, some of that information is more easily coming in so that the person would be able to have some time and space to notice, oh, I do have this question about this person, or, oh, this is so wonderful, but there is this thing that feels a little off. And the pause allows for that information to be known.
Yeah. And there's, I think, two reasons the pause helps with that. One, any of us, regardless of whether we're in a relationship with a narcissist, there's a whole chemical cascade that happens when we start to fall for somebody that can actually make it, this is why we have the phrase love is blind, can make it hard to really see what's so. This is, people have often heard of the honeymoon phase, which lasts anywhere from a few months to a couple of years usually. And within that, we don't really see things quite as accurately as we might outside of that phase. And so the pause at least gives us some chance of letting our hormones calm down a bit enough that we come back to the part of us that really will be present for the majority of the relationship if it's a long-term one, once we get past the honeymoon phase. So there's that piece. And then also with relating to a narcissist, because of the lead bombing and the fast forwarding, because of the ways that they know how to play into a romantic partner's fantasy, there's also going to be a coming back to earth from all of the ways that they tend to sort of flood a romantic partner's attention. There's just so much input, so much what seems like positive input, that it can be hard to feel into ourselves because we're still kind of processing, we're overwhelmed with all of the positive attention. So allowing ourselves to, which can be really hard, step away from the kind of glut of praise and whatnot, does leave a lot of space to retune back into oneself. Yeah.
I find that pacing so important. And sometimes when I'm working with clients who are dating, there can be a desire to go fast. So this is an example of where, let's say I'm a single person and I'm dating, and I'm also aware, oh, I want to find the person who's just right for me. And I want to be aware of some narcissism because I've had some experiences in the past. But I also like to go fast.
Yeah.
And the pause and the pacing is so excruciating for me.
Yeah.
So what would you say to me or somebody like that description?
Yeah. I mean, I would say first and foremost, of course, it's so yummy. It's so pleasurable. We're designed to other human beings. It's not a bad part of you that go quickly. And if you've had the experience of being love bombed or getting caught up in those kinds of relationships, let that wiser, slower part of you pull you back a little bit. You don't have to not see them, right? It doesn't have to be not pleasurable to date. Just enough where you can hear yourself. Because if you have been in one of those relationships with a narcissist, you know that the short-term pleasure does not in the end justify the longer-term terror and hell that can come from really getting involved with somebody who's not a good fit. So yeah, just kind of balancing the younger or more impulsive, more wild part with the part that's like, we're going to take good care of you so that you're safe and loved in the long term, not just at the start of this relationship.
This sounds like where mindfulness comes in. So healthy dose of mindfulness.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. which is there in really healthy, happy, long-term relationships. We have the capacity to see the parts of us that get activated or scared and to work with them and to advocate for them and to protect them. And that does take pausing, noticing, being present with, even when it's not very comfortable.
Yeah. Again, there's that emotional maturity that I hear you talking about where with enough emotional maturity, a person can tolerate some discomfort in those mindful choices. So maybe I want to zoom ahead, but I'm going to pace myself and allow myself to be a little uncomfortable so that I can stay connected with them as I move forward and do a swan dive into love.
Yeah. 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 And I would also encourage that person. Some of that is just going to be biological, that desire to speed up. And for some of us, when we also have a tendency to go fast, what that reflects is an anxious attachment style, is some sort of relational trauma we're trying to fix or heal. And so just really using that pause, that pacing pause to notice what is getting activated in me by this relationship.
Mhm.
And is my desire to go really fast pointing to some part of me that needs some healing and some attention? Maybe the part of me who never could get mom's attention fully. And so that part thinks, well, this person is kind of similar to mom on some level, even though I'm not fully conscious of it. So maybe this time I've gotten her attention. So, full speed ahead. We're going to finally have this thing that we really wanted. And I think that's a very understandable response, but also not the place where we want to make a decision about an adult relationship.
So wise. So, given that the beginning of a relationship with a narcissist can be so fun and compelling and exciting and feel really good with all the love bombing and all sorts of loveliness, what happens that is the turn where a person might start to question, wait a second, a year in or even a month in, or who knows how long, 10 years in, and they think to themselves, no, I've been putting up with this for so long, blah, 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 something, something. What is that turn that happens?
Mm. Yeah, when you say what is the turn, like what is it that helps people wake up to what's happening?
I'm sorry for not being more clear. What I am wanting to point to is that a narcissist can be so fun to be around. And there can also be some very manipulative styles of communicating, some hurtful ways of gaslighting, some holes for codependency that can create a very codependent bond. So, what is happening that the charm isn't everything? There's something else that's happening too. Um, and and whether or not a person wakes up to it right away, it's happening before they wake up to it.
For sure. Yeah. And so what is that? What's the
What is
opposite of
that?
the charm?
Yeah, like what kind of light can you shed on the shadow side of narcissism?
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So the shadow side, but I think of narcissism as this very complex personality structure that is built to protect the narcissist from feeling shame.
Mhm.
Um, they often have come from a very shaming family system and do not know how to validate themselves, their worth, without things like praise or accolades or what's called a narcissistic supply. Um, so the shallow side is the insecurity that they're not good enough. And that when that gets activated in some way, maybe they don't get a promotion at work, or their child gets a C on their report card, or their partner gains weight. All these things to them might lower their status in the eyes of others. When those types of things happen, they're typically going to resort to putting others down in some way. So the flip side of that love bombing coin is devaluation.
Mm.
So this is where relationships with narcissists can be incredibly confusing, because you can start out feeling like you are the most beautiful person in the world because that's what this person has communicated to you. And then at some point, their ego gets impacted, either in the relationship or out, and they may turn to instead start to criticize you, put you down, encourage you not to spend time with your loved ones, to make belittling comments, and or just kind of treat you like you're not there. It can be a very sort of detached narcissist. You almost feel like you're invisible when you're around them.
Mm.
It's this real flip-flop between feeling like, again, the most beautiful person in the world, and then perhaps the worst person in the world.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so hard. And when I imagine into being that person who's in relationship with a narcissist, I imagine a lot of confusion. Like, wait, this person really loves me. Is what they're saying feedback that I need to take to grow with? Or is it feels bad, but is that on me? Like, I can feel into a lot of self-questioning can happen in a relationship such as you describe.
Absolutely. The inconsistency creates a lot of confusion. The high of the high and the low of the low, that contrast can create a lot of self-doubt.
Mm.
And a lot of people feel, not everyone, but a lot of people who get into relationships with narcissists have experience from childhood being in relationship with a narcissistic caregiver. And so there's even more self-doubt in that instance. They're not
Mhm.
aware of that history or working with it, because it can feel normal while still feeling bad.
Mhm. 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 And so in that moment of realizing, oh, I think I might be in a relationship with a narcissist, or even the way that I take it is, I don't know what's happening, but it doesn't feel good. It's not balancing out for me. But let's say that I'm in a relationship with a narcissist. How do I leave? How does a person do that well?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a huge question. And I think it a complicated one depending on the situation, right? Some people are married to narcissists, they have kids. Some people are, working under a narcissist and they need to keep their job. Um, so I think there's a lot of different approaches. For some people, if they've really discovered that and are ready to leave, the solution is what's called a cutoff. If they're able to do that, which is cutting off communication, really just not allowing that person in their life. The idea behind that is a narcissist is generally not going to change and can also be quite damaging in their behaviors. And so there's also there can be a sort of addictive quality to relationships with narcissists because of the intermittent reinforcement inherent in their behavior, meaning some of the time they're super loving and available, and other times they're devaluing and demeaning. That kind of back and forth pushes on the same biology that a lot of addiction does.
Mhm.
It's a little bit like a slot machine. You don't know what you're going to get from your narcissistic friend or partner.
Mhm.
It keeps you hooked. So the cutoff stops that kind of slot machine experience by
Mhm.
just not going to the slot machine at all. So that's one approach. And again, it can be really complicated.
Mhm.
So I think for those who stay in a relationship with narcissists, maybe for their safety or other reasons, there are ways to sort of manage the narcissist differently. Some of the tactics there include the great communication tool called BIFF, BIFF,
Oh.
which is when you communicate with a narcissist, you're brief, informative, friendly, and firm.
Mhm. Mhm.
So let's say you're co-parenting with a narcissist and they send you a scathing email about how your choices with your child are ruining your child's life and you should be doing X, Y, or Z, you might respond with a very brief email that says, I am so grateful for your concern about our child. I will be signing their permission slip for this field trip on Tuesday. Take care. In some ways, not playing into their sort of hold for drama or for putting you down while retaining your boundary. Yeah, so there's tactics like that that can allow you to, as much as possible, keep them at a distance while still having them in your life if that's necessary.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that would actually give the narcissist some of what they need too, which is there is some connection in that BIF style of communicating. Part of what I love about speaking with you, and I've had Nikki Kurtner on as well, who's also a licensed therapist, and part of my interest is in balancing out these perspectives of there's the narcissist and there's a person or people who are affected by the narcissist. It's so valuable to me to remember that both people are important. And the narcissist is going through something that is extremely challenging inside, which does not excuse the behavior because it can be damaging and abusive. And at the same time, when we consider that the narcissist is a person, I start to see how BIF as a style of communication can partly satisfy some of what the narcissist needs because there is some connection in that style of communicating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right on. Another sort of school of thought really encourages praising the narcissist, which can feel a little counterintuitive, like you don't want them to be reliant on you as a supply, but just allowing them to have a little bit of that, you are so generous for raising this issue with me. I have always really admired that about you. And that might really actually bring things down a couple notches. I think you have to kind of play around with it depending on the person that you're interacting with. But yeah, again, I think you're right on. There may be a place for, in ways that don't hurt you, giving them some of the care that they ultimately are so desperate for.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and also to balance out my previous question about leaving, there are some people who are truly in love with a person who is a narcissist or who has strong narcissistic tendencies. I hear you beginning to describe some ways of being in a healthier relationship with somebody with such strong tendencies. And given your expertise in dating and relationship, how does it play out when somebody says, you know what? I'm doing this. And the narcissist may or may not be able to hold a diagnosis or take it seriously or identify themselves. I think that there's a spectrum of how a person with that personality type might take the word narcissism, usually not well, but I think there are some who can consider the possibility. But how do you see that playing out if a couple's like, I'm doing this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'll answer your question quite the way that you're imagining. So you tell me, but the first thing I think about is when I hear that, my job as a therapist or coach is to acknowledge that this person is clear on what they want, even if in my shoes, that's not what I would choose. They're like, even if there's a part of me that's like, girl, run. And in that, if a narcissistic relationship includes a lot of boundary violations, which it typically does,
Yeah.
it is really important for me as their helper to not violate a boundary that they very clearly set, which is, I am not available to talk about ending this relationship. So that's a little bit more I want to say. First and foremost, just accepting this is where they are from my perspective. And some people make it work their whole lives. Sometimes it's a very, very painful relationship, and some make it work in a way that feels tolerable to them through some of the approaches that I was sharing earlier of like, okay, you're going to find a way to disarm the narcissist, so to speak. And, you know, they may ultimately feel as though that is the right choice and meaningful because of their values, right? I think in particular about couples who have kids and
Mhm.
perhaps come from a religious background where divorce is not an option.
Mhm.
And so for them, it is worth being in a dynamic with a narcissist because they get to fulfill their commitment to their faith, for example, and their kids. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it definitely goes in the direction that I was looking toward. And it brings up the other part of this puzzle, which is the children of narcissists. Because in reality, the guests on my show, three of them who wanted to speak about narcissism were children of narcissists. And they all, let me think, they all describe abuse, emotional. I think one was so extreme that the law was involved. And only one guest spoke about a partnership. And so it would be so wonderful to give a little airtime to the children of narcissists and the healing of that and what a child might choose or growing up to become an adult and having some perspective. How does a person release that toxicity and heal from the trauma?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a big question. And I definitely, in my practice, a significant number of the people that I work with are children or grandchildren of narcissists. And it does leave such a deep wound because I think a lot of children of narcissists come out of their family system feeling unsafe and
Mhm.
unworthy, particularly in relationships. So I think it's really important. The first step that I see in the healing process is even being able to acknowledge that one parent or caregiver was a narcissist and that had an impact. And the reason that's really important is that a lot of narcissistic family systems operate under an immense amount of denial and minimization. There's a narrative often of, we have a very happy family. We are very functional. If you're upset about something, it's because you're too sensitive. And not all, as you might be able to kind of see, thinking about the narcissist is another way that the narcissist reputation gets upheld,
Mhm.
right? The narcissistic parent, if they had a dysfunctional family, that's going to lower their status, right? So it behooves them and their ego to really paint the picture of a happy family. So first and foremost is even just acknowledging the narcissistic family system and acknowledging, yes, this had an impact on me, which can take a long time for people to acknowledge that. And once they get there, there's a lot of good work that can be done. I think coming back to telling one's story, therapy, spiritual counseling, spaces where the child of a narcissist can tell their story and get feedback are incredibly important.
Mhm.
There are so many people, and I've worked with a lot of people like this, where they will start to tell the story of their childhood, experiences they had as a little one, and they will start their first few rounds of telling the story will be like, yeah, my parents were really focused on my academic success, but they were very supportive. Or, yeah, my dad, like, he was really, really, he had a bit of a temper, but ultimately he was just like such an amazing man.
Mhm.
And as we dig a little bit further into specific memories, you know, memories of abuse rise up,
Mhm.
but they don't necessarily share those memories with that awareness. And I think a really good therapist or counselor will ask good questions and kind of allow more of the story to come to the surface that they can then respond to and say, I got to tell you, that actually doesn't sound like a really good man, a really good father
Mm-hmm.
would do that to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think that therapist and counselor, if they're really skilled, would also go very slow with that and check in and say, how do you feel about hearing that? So the work can be slow moving. And again, in some ways focused on breaking through the denial so that over time, the story becomes much more integrated, and it comes less from the cognitive, this is the narrative my family has given me, and comes more with a sense of presence in their body, presence in emotion, presence in vulnerability. Maybe sometimes it comes with tears, rather than that sense of, I've told this story a million times about my family, kind of rote and a little bit stale. And I find as that storytelling does start to feel more present and more alive, a lot of feelings start to come to the surface. And then the work is around, okay, how do we be with big feelings?
Mm.
Because a narcissistic family system is not okay with feeling other than perhaps joy, if the joy makes the narcissistic liquid, or the narcissist trait.
Yeah, such a good point. So, what a huge healing a person would feel when some of those feelings start to poke through, and then the therapist give the person more and more space, and perhaps they get to know themselves as a feeling person who can feel in a safe way, which is probably a new experience for a child of a narcissist.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think either in tandem for these different pieces we've been talking about, or once the narrative starts to shift, a lot of work in my experience, and this is partially because I specialize in relationships, is to look at how does your childhood show up in your relationships? Are you continually choosing partners who love bomb you and then devalue you, right? Are you choosing friends who can't center your needs, but only can talk about what's going on in their lives,
Mhm.
right? And then to start to really look at what would it look like to choose different relationships or to show up differently in the relationships that you have, such that you're not caught in the same dynamics that you were in childhood.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. And so to go a little bit further here, and again, if I embody what we're talking about, if I have been raised by a narcissist and I begin to find spaces like a therapeutic space where I can feel safely, I get to know my feelings and that I can feel and be safe at the same time, then
Mhm.
perhaps I begin to naturally create more and more community or job choices or partnership choices that are also safe feeling spaces
Yeah,
because I know that about myself now. I know that I can do that. And so there's a whole world of emotional safety.
right. It can be like there's a new universe that's opened up that you didn't know was possible before.
I appreciate you so much, Jessica.
Mm. I appreciate you too.
Is there more? Thank you for saying that, by the way. No, really, I've admired your work ever since I first met you and all of my clients in the past, back when I was in California and some of my clients would go to your groups for dating and social anxiety. They would always report such wonderful growth and playfulness that they experienced with you. And knowing you and knowing some of how you work, and of course, sharing a client or two, I really appreciate your professionalism, your sensitivity, and your follow through. That from my eyes, you take your work very seriously, and there's a fulfilling passion in what you do that's touching the lives of so many in person. And now with your podcast, because you also have a podcast, you're reaching even more people.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for saying that. Yeah, I think I think one of the driving factors of how I show up in my professional life is related to what we were just talking about, the children of narcissists wanting to be a different example of a leader. Because I don't know about you, but most of the people that I know, clients and loved ones, have had bosses or teachers or parents or therapists even who aren't able to take full responsibility of their position and show up in a way that's inspiring and reliable. And so, yeah, and again, just appreciate that reflection. And I hope to be a corrective experience.
Mm, indeed. Is there more that you would like to share, Jessica, about what we're talking about, narcissism and dating and relationships, or about your work in general, or anything that's just in your heart that we've touched on and you want to go deeper into, or that you haven't said yet that you want some space for?
Mm. I think I have, so you mentioned I have a podcast. I have an episode coming out that may be out by the time this one airs. I don't know, about intentionally assessing compatibility in relationships and running what I call compatibility experiments to really get a sense of what's possible in a relationship. And that, I think that concept goes hand in hand with pacing in relationships. So I would just, recommend listening to that episode. And I really want to encourage your listener, if they are recovering from a narcissistic relationship and building new relationships, whether they're romantic or not, just to know that it is entirely possible to build healthy relationships. And I think that what that takes is a lot of mindfulness and a lot of like embracing dating or getting to know a friend or job interviews, even as an intentional, mindful process through which they can learn what's possible in a relationship. And that, you really have more power over your relationship than you may have felt before, than you may have been made to feel in childhood or in that narcissistic relationship.
Well, that episode that you describe about compatibility seems right in alignment with all we've been speaking about today. And I love your encouragement and reflection that people can heal and people do heal and new kinds of relationships can be formed. It's entirely possible.
Yeah. Do I get to shower you with affection? Are you, can you take it in?
Let's see. This is the compatibility experiment.
No, I already know I'm compatible with you. I just want to shower you, and I promise I'm not love bombing you. I just want to appreciate you for being, I think, a corrective experience for a lot of people. You've, as long as I've known you, shown up. I really think of you as an embodiment of love, an embodiment of playfulness, and you are so wholeheartedly in whatever interaction you're in. And the little bits that I've listened to your story on the show, you could very easily have turned out differently. And you have done a lot of work to be able to show up with incredible mindfulness and love. Yeah, thank you for being out there, giving other people a different experience of how people can show up in relationships.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for hearing that about my life. I could have turned out differently. I affirm that that's true. I'm so glad that I made choices of love and healing, and it wasn't easy. I'm saying this publicly because healing is not always easy. In fact, it's not usually easy. The benefit is easy. The
Yeah.
benefit, wonderful, totally worth it. But in those moments of, in my case, really choosing, do I pass on the abuse that was given to me? Because it's easy, it's actually very easy to pass on abuse that's given to a person.
Yeah.
In that moment of my own pause and my own pacing in my own life has been very challenging and very rewarding. And I say this from childhood onward. So I continue to make choices. Do I really want to say this or do this? And I did. And so now how do I apologize or reconnect? The healing and growth path is amazing. And I encourage everyone to be on it. And just to say, it's so beautiful that you noticed something about my life story. So thank you.
Mhm. Thank you.
Your show, Jessica, is I Love You Too. Is that right?
That's right. You got it. I love you too.
I love you
Which is
too.
basically what we're hoping our what we call our dear listener, whoever listens to the show, ultimately gets to hearing every day by listening to our show. So build the relationship in their life where they get to hear, I love you too.
Mhm. And where can everyone find you other than your show? How do you like to be discovered?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is at relationshipcenter.com. I Love You Too is on all of the different podcast platforms. You can also find it at relationshipcenter.com/podcast. And on my website, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's a bunch of the social icons. So you can find me on Instagram, etc. But I would highly recommend both listening to the show and signing up for our newsletter, which you can do on that website.
Hmm. And I think on your website, you have a really wonderful article. I'm pulling it up. How unresolved childhood trauma causes relationship problems. And there is some information in there about narcissism, but it's not only about narcissism. And it's a wonderful article along with all the other resources that you provide.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a great one to read. And we're often adding new content there. So feel free to check out the blog.
Mm. Thank you so much for this conversation, Jessica. Thank you for your presence and being willing to dive in with me and see what happens.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Ray.